Hello and welcome to the 11 Plus Verbal Reasoning webinar. In this particular webinar, I'm going to be talking to you about all the areas of the 11 Plus. As a parent myself, I know how difficult that decision is, trying to find the right school and wondering what the process for applications are and the entrance exams and how to prepare. So hopefully this webinar will put your mind at rest and give you some strategies of where to find information and where to start. So a little bit about me. My name's Joanne Adams. I'm a qualified primary teacher. I qualified in 2009 and worked in the classroom for a number of years up to 2020, COVID. I started tutoring before I actually left the classroom. I started tutoring 10 years ago now in 2015, and I have to say I love it. I love it much more than working in the classroom because I can dedicate myself to what the children in my that work with me need, and I can use personalised strategies to help them progress. I'm rated 5 stars on Google by parents that I've worked with over the years, and I've also published my very own workbook, the Busy Bees Times Tables workbook. I published that in January 2023, and that's available on Amazon. I launched the 11 Plus Verbal Reasoning Programme in September 2023, really with the aim of I know that children who attend a preparatory school or private primary school, they usually cover some verbal reasoning at school, whereas mainstream primary schools, most mainstream primary schools don't include it. So I felt there was very much a need for children who were wanting to move from a mainstream primary school to a grammar school or private secondary school that had entrance exams to actually give them the support in this particular unusual subject. I'll talk more about verbal reasoning later on. And I also launched the Happy Hedgehog brand of learning as well. So my company is Joanne Adams Primary Tuition, but my Happy Hedgehog is the brand of my new workbooks, programs, and lots of other resources where you can help your child learn from home. So tonight, there looks like there's lots and lots of different things. I'm going to try and keep it to about half an hour because I know you've got other things as busy parents that you want to do. But I'm going to be looking at the different exam boards, the different subjects, the difference in exam structures. I'm going to explain the difference between verbal and non-verbal reasoning. I'm also going to talk a little bit about my 11 Plus Verbal Reasoning Programme towards the end as well, so that if you are looking for some help in this subject, I can support you and your child with that. If you're wanting to take the journey on your own as parents, I'll also point you in the right direction for some resources and advice too. And at the end of the session, I'll be taking some questions and answers. So let's start with the different exam boards. Each school uses their own entrance exam. A parent said to me, is there not just a centre where we can sit the 11 Plus for all the schools? And that would be wonderful, but that's not the case. Every school does things in a slightly different way. They all choose which exam body they're going to use, and you sit that exam with that particular school. So for every school you're interested in, you need to register your child and they need to sit the exam with that school. The main exam boards, there's 4 main bodies. There's the GL assessment, the CEM, the ISEB and the CAT4. They're the 4 main independent exam bodies that write resources, write exam papers for the 11 Plus. However, some schools write their own, but from my experience, they're usually heavily influenced by one of the above. I do a lot of work with GL. I work with CEM and others as well, but many of the many of the secondary schools that I work with helping pupils support the 11 Plus is GL. However, one of the local schools is CEM, so it's important to know the difference. The best way to find out is to go to the school's website. On their admissions page, they should state which exam body they are using, whether it's GL, whether they write their own. Most schools actually have one sample paper that you can download as well, so you can get a feel for what the layout, what the exam body, what the subject your child will be tested in. So there are different subjects. Schools like to choose their suite of subjects that they test their pupils on. Some schools will only test English, maths and verbal reasoning. Some schools will test English, maths, verbal reasoning, non-verbal reasoning. Some schools will only test on maths and verbal reasoning. It really depends on the school. So again, it's worth checking out their website to make sure that you're prepared appropriately. So there's 4 main subjects, but they tend to be referred to in different ways. There's English. Sometimes that can be disguised as verbal reasoning, but it is English, and I'll talk about what I mean by English in a minute. There's maths, which also can be referred to sometimes as numerical reasoning. Again, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. There's verbal reasoning, which is a subject on its own. There's different types actually as well, which again I'll talk about. And then there's non-verbal reasoning. So 4 different subjects. English comprises of comprehension, spelling, punctuation and grammar. Most of those exams, no matter what their exam body, comprise of those top 4 elements. Some schools will also hold a creative writing, like a question within their paper as well. Not all schools do. Some schools don't test creative writing whatsoever. They just test the top 4 skills. If your child is doing okay in comprehension in school, that's great. However, in mainstream primary schools, for SATs, it's not as heavily weighted in terms of inference and deduction skills, whereas the 11 plus is. So children in a mainstream primary school will usually, a good reader will be very good at finding a fact in a text and writing the answer on the paper. The 11 plus is looking for a little bit more than that. They're looking for you to find a fact and process that fact to come up with an answer. For example, a text may say that an event happened in 1975 and the same thing happened 10 years later. And the question might say, what was the most recent event? It's expecting the children to have read that it was 1975, but actually the one it's asking them about is the 10 years later. So it's 1985, the answer. Subtle differences, but it does require that deeper reading. So your child does need to be a regular reader. If they're not already, get them reading a range of quality texts. One of the things I think children at the moment, I want to say the majority of pupils that I'm seeing over the last couple of years are struggling more with the vocabulary. And that's because the modern literature, and there's some great books out there, and they need to love reading. It's not just about just reading for the sake of learning, it's reading for enjoyment. However, modern literature doesn't necessarily have the depth of vocabulary required for the 11 plus. More traditional literature that you might have heard of, like the Railway Children, Gulliver's Travels, The Secret Garden, those style of texts, they have historical words that they might be unfamiliar with. They have historical contexts that they might be unfamiliar with, like putting coal on the fire, communication by pigeon, horse and car, all these things that as adults we know, but children don't. It's a completely different world to them. So they do need to be absorbed in those worlds. And if you want me to send you a list of recommended texts across the 11 plus spectrum, let me know. So it's about variety, but it's also about adding in that classical literature as well. Spelling, they do need good robust spelling. They need to understand the rules around punctuation, including things like colons, semicolons, apostrophes, and also grammar, the appropriate words. If you're like me from Preston, occasionally we don't use the appropriate word in a sentence through speech. We need to make sure that in our writing, or if we're reading a written passage, that we could spot the appropriate word, even if we don't actually say it in Preston, because I know sometimes we use quite a lot of slang in my area. Maths. The basics, you must have a really good times tables knowledge and be really good at recalling those facts and understanding division, because it's expecting a higher level of math skill than that expected in the Year 6 curriculum. So in terms of preparation, you'll hear many people sort of say, oh, don't get a tutor, you don't need a tutor. That's in some ways okay, that's right. But if you think of preparatory schools and private primary schools, their curriculum is accelerated, so the children have covered these aspects before they sit the 11 plus exam. Now, bearing in mind some schools' exam season is September of Year 6, pupils in mainstream primary school won't have covered these topics. So it's unfair to expect them to be able to answer questions that they've never come across or they've never had any experience of learning, no matter what their ability. More able children need to have covered these areas so that at least they can answer the question. They know what it's asking of them. So it may include basic algebra, ratio, proportion, pie charts, and basic nth term, all of which are only just touched on in Year 6, but in the summer, which will be after the 11 plus exam. So make sure your child is doing a little bit extra of maths at home, or seek out the support of a tutor. Yes, grammar schools say you shouldn't use a tutor and things like that, but it's about creating a level playing field in the exam so that every child has the opportunity. If other children have been taught how to do basic algebra, they're more likely to be able to answer a question on basic algebra than a child that hasn't been taught it. However, the child that hasn't been taught it may be more able than the child that has. So again, I come from a place of just giving children an opportunity, particularly those from mainstream backgrounds who haven't had the tuition or direction in this area. Then there's verbal reasoning, a quite peculiar subject that isn't covered in primary schools at all. It is in private preparatory schools. Usually in Key Stage 2 they start some verbal reasoning, but not in mainstream. It's not in the national curriculum. So again, if your child is in a mainstream primary school, you do need to set some time aside to work on these skills. I will go into more detail on this later in the presentation, but it includes vocabulary, having that higher level of vocabulary to associate words, find the opposites of words and categorize words as well. Alphabetical order is a key skill within there. You do need to have some math skills behind you, your times table skills, number facts, be able to calculate as well. There is a tiny bit of maths in there. There's lots of analysis. There's lots that require a child to read a question and pick out important information to be able to understand what it's asking you to do. There's code breaking, which I love. There's also little scenarios as well where you've got to reason logically, you know, those ones that are in the newspaper, and you've got to work out which is most likely to happen or which is least likely to happen, or indeed come to an answer and unpick it. And resilience, I do put that on there because generally more able pupils will go through primary school not really without any struggles. They will usually learn what they're taught and apply it really, really well. Whereas verbal reasoning at their age, when they come into it at 9, 10 or 11, it's going to be something completely new to them, and therefore they are going to struggle at times, and they are going to find it a little bit unusual, and they are going to find it a little bit tricky. And it's being able to just have that confidence to keep pushing through and to keep going, and they certainly need that in the exam as well. So yeah, a little bit of resilience needed as well. Then we've got non-verbal reasoning, and I'll show you an example on the next couple of slides of what it actually looks like. It is a different subject to verbal reasoning. It's more shape-based. It requires observation. Again, those good analysis skills. What is the question asking me to do? Can I spot a pattern, a sequence? Can I see some logic to how it's been formed? And again, that resilience. Because when you do start non-verbal reasoning, it's like, what on earth are these patterns? What is it asking me to do? And again, if your child's been used to finding school quite easily and finding learning quite easily, sometimes they have that little stumbling block of go, this is too hard, I just don't understand it, I don't get it, and a little bit of resistance that we need to overcome. So let's have a look at the difference in structures of exams, because they are different, they're held in different ways. So GL tends to be separate subject papers. If the school tests on English, there will be an English paper. If the school tests for maths, there's a maths paper, verbal reasoning paper, non-verbal reasoning paper. They are multiple choice. They're usually given a grid with multiple choice answers. Now that sounds easier. In essence, it's not. The 5 choices are usually given similarity. So in the maths paper, for example, the common mistakes will be some of the possible answers, not because it's trying to trip them up, but it's really trying to distinguish the accuracy of the pupils. If you imagine 300 pupils sitting in the same exam, they're looking for ability, accuracy and speed all in one. So whilst multiple choice seems easier, generally it's not. It's more based on speed. Why do they use a grid? for different reasons. Some schools traditionally sit and mark them by hand, and the teachers mark them. Other schools, it goes through a computer generated, so it's a photograph and they're looking for the pattern in the answers to feed back. It's generally quicker to mark that type of paper than the traditional SATs paper and things that you may have seen. So in the English, there is, generally speaking, 56 marks. However, this year, have noticed it was 58. There's a couple more questions in there. And I think that's going to be a trend because I see that there's more pupils applying and they've got to distinguish between those pupils somewhere. And I think by putting a couple of extra questions in the English and a few extra questions in the maths, it's helping schools do that. So yes, traditionally, and all the materials will be English 56 marks and maths 50. But as I say, some of the schools have put a little sentence on their assessment page on their website saying there may be a few more questions. Verbal reasoning is usually 80 questions and non-verbal reasoning is 40. So there is a good deal of balancing accuracy and speed with GL. CEM is different. They tend to have, and again it depends on school, they tend to have 2 exam papers. And within each exam paper, there's sections, and each section's timed. So they might be asked to spend 14 minutes on some maths questions, and then they'll stop, put the pencil down, and then they might be asked to spend the next 30 minutes on a comprehension. And then they may be asked to stop and then spend another 14 minutes on some non-verbal reasoning. It's mixed up. They do have a break between 2 papers, but they're mixed up. And CEM very much uses numerical reasoning rather than the word maths. For the comprehension, they could be given a grid again where they've got to colour in a particular letter, whether it's the answers A, B, C or D. But in maths, they've usually got to write the answer. Sometimes that's just a line, but sometimes it's boxes they've got to fill in. So again, it's important that you prepare for the right test. If you're doing 2 separate schools and they're 2 different exam bodies, don't panic. What I would do is when you come and you've covered all the skills, practice GL 1 week, learn from that, then practice CEM the next week. And then nearer the time, obviously focus on your priority school, the one you want to get into the most and what's first in the diary. But again, I'll talk about the most important thing first is skill development, not exam papers. So verbal reasoning, let's have a look at the difference between them. This is non-verbal reasoning. It's shape-based, okay? You might have seen Mensa tests or had tests when you're at school that, test your levels of intelligence by using these shapes. I'll be honest, there's lots of different layers of intelligence. There's not just academic intelligence. There's emotional intelligence, communication intelligence, lots and lots of layers to it. So it does show a certain aspect of a person. It does, this particular exam does tell you a lot about a pupil. It doesn't give the whole picture. And I don't know of any school that just relies on a non-verbal test for entrance exams. So there's different skills and things that we need to cover: shape, layering, shading, edges, patterns, sequences, rotation, symmetry. There's also some spatial and visual awareness as well. There's a great one where you've got to imagine a piece of paper folded up and you use a hole punch and there's a hole, and then when you unpeel that paper, where would the holes be? That's a great one. Does it come up in all the exam papers, but it is quite a challenging one, that, and it needs lots of folding papers and a hole punch to try and imagine that. There's some bird's eye view style questions as well. Again, I love non-verbal reasoning, but it is different to verbal reasoning. So verbal reasoning, there's lots of different types of questions. It's a real mixture. It's not just shapes or anything like that. In fact, shapes aren't really involved. Anagrams, particularly in the CEM exam, can they rearrange letters to spell a word correctly? Alphabetical order is vital. Can they categorize words and objects? Can they break codes? Can they find a rule? Can they apply that rule? Can they find hidden words in a sentence? Can they rejumble a sentence to make sense? Can they identify a rule and apply it? Can they solve logic problems? Can they use numerical reasoning? Can they complete a sentence with missing words or jumbled words? Can they sequence letters and numbers? Can they put vocabulary into categories? And can they rearrange word puzzles? There's all sorts, loads of it. But I love it. I am one of these people that buy the book at the airport and sit on the plane with all the puzzles. It whiles away the hours for me. And I suppose it was going to be written in the stars that I'd write a programme to help other pupils with something that I love. So here's a few examples. These are taken from familiarisation papers. So this is a categorisation example. You've got 5 words: clear, conclude, finish, terminate and prevent. And 2 of them don't match the category. So we've got conclude, finish and terminate. They all have very similar meanings, whereas clear and prevent are the odd ones out. Now to adults, we understand terminate, we understand conclude, but does a 9-10-year-old actually understand? Have they ever had any exposure to those words? They might have heard of the word conclusion, but have they associated that with the word conclude? So I do a lot of work with vocabulary because it tends to be synonyms, similar words, antonyms, opposite words, and categorisation like this tend to be areas that children find difficult because they haven't got that higher level vocabulary. Codes, one of my favourites, but one of the longer questions. Again, we talk about choosing and timing ourselves appropriately in solving questions like this. So you're given 4 words: nail, find, late and fist, and then you're given 3 codes. Each code matches a word, but obviously there's a code missing. So the way you look at that, you look at where the letters fall. So for example, you've got A in 2 of the words in the same place. So you would be looking for a number that falls in the same place in 2 of the codes. However, I is as well. So A or I could be a 6. If you look 5, 6, 7, 4, 4, 6, 8, 9. So we've identified an A or an I is 6. Then you're looking for other patterns. So the word nail ends in an L and the word late starts with an L. So is there any codes that end with a number that's the same number that starts a word? So 5, 6, 7, 4 being the L, 4, 6, 8, 9. So we've detected that nail must be 5, 6, 7, 4 and late must be 4, 6, 8, 9. So by a process of deduction, working through all those patterns, to find the word for 4963 is leaf. Now you can see from those answers, they're not far apart. They're all the same letters, aren't they? Just generally speaking, rearranged. So yeah, it does take some deduction. It also takes some practice in learning not to spend too long. Once you've got the first 2 letters and that's leading you to your answer, great, move on. You don't have to find every letter because you haven't got the time in an exam. The next one, a word puzzle. This is all about letters. So if you think of the order of search, so S is the first, E is the second, A is the third, R is the fourth, so on and so on and so on. Near has been made by pinching letters from search and lotion. So it's taken the last letter from lotion, the second letter from search, the third letter from search, and the 4th letter from search. So when you come to CAMRA and strong, what you would need to do is take the last letter of strong, being a G, the second letter of CAMRA, which is an A, the third letter of CAMRA, which is an M, and therefore you've got game. So enough about verbal reasoning question styles. There is lots more. But if you're wanting to take the preparation journey at home with your child, here are lots of resources I recommend. There are loads of them out there. CGP, Bond, Collins, Let's, Schofield and Sim, endless. I always tend to use CGP. They're not necessarily challenging enough, but they're a good start for skills first, because we want children to succeed, don't we? We want them to start at the beginning and build up those skills and build up those confidence. There's no point throwing them in at the deep end with something too hard because they'll get frustrated. So I find CGP a really good starting point. It's important to cover all the skills of whichever subject you're working on first. So cover all the math skills first, cover all the English skills first, cover all the verbal reasoning skills, and so on, before jumping into practice papers. Practice papers are an important second step, But I very often get phone calls from parents saying that, oh, we've done all the practice papers and they're not getting any better and their scores are still faltering and things like that. If you start with practice papers without the skills, the scores are unlikely to improve. Your child will become demoralised and they are going to be less likely in engaging with this journey. They need to be on board. They need to want to sit the exam. They need to want to go to the school for the best success and to be able to perform at their best. So skills first, then practice papers. I advise not introducing a timer till nearer the exam. And the reason for that is it's more about the practice and covering all the question types first before getting into whether your speed is appropriate, whether you're choosing the right questions to skip and come back to at the end. Most exam bodies produce their own materials, so make sure you're practicing the appropriate ones. If you're sitting a GL exam, practice with GL practice papers. If you're sitting a CEM exam, practice with CEM. There's usually at least one free download on the exam board. There may even be a free download on the school website as well. We talked about vocabulary. Spelling is also one, and children often, even the best spellers, struggle with homophones. And that's because those words that sound exactly the same but are spelt differently for different contexts, like dye. You can have food dye or clothing dye that changes the colour of your clothes, and you can have dye where someone passes away. It's about understanding the right context because they come up. There is a free download that I've produced, something you can just print off, stick on the fridge and tick them off as your child knows them. If you want to use the QR code, it's just there and you can download your own copy. So to summarise, top tips: don't dive into test practice too quickly, focus on skill development first and use the appropriate resources. Prioritise practice over timings and technique at the beginning and ask the child to complete the full paper. Make sure between papers you're identifying where the tricky bits are and practicing those before you try another paper. That's where you'll have that success. That's where you'll get to improve your score each time. If you're looking for some help with 11 plus verbal reasoning, I run a program specifically for the GL. It's a 14-week program, specialist tuition with me. Within that program, we focus on vocabulary every single week. We learn 8 new words because as I've already mentioned, it's important in the English test as well as the verbal reasoning test. We cover all the skills and techniques for the GL exam, and we also apply them to a variety of exam questions. The group is kept to a maximum of 6 pupils, and that's to ensure that every child gets personal feedback. There's also directed practice between the sessions to practice and consolidate what they've learnt with me. And there's a learning hub to access with all the recordings and downloads. So if your child's ill or misses a session or wants to re-watch a particular skill because they're finding it tricky, it's all there and you've got access all the way to the exam. The programme starts next week on Wednesday at 6:30. There is only 6 spaces because I want to keep it a nice small group, and once it's full, that's it. The programme won't be running again till September. I only run it twice a year in line with exam seasons. The programme itself is just £210. It works out at just £15 per week, which is an absolute bargain for specialist tuition. I am aware that with tuition, parents sometimes have an English tutor and a maths tutor, and I wanted to make something affordable so that verbal reasoning isn't overlooked, particularly if your child is at a mainstream school. They won't have covered any of this. So it is deliberately priced to be really, really affordable at £15 per week. But the price is going up in September. This is the 4th group that I've run it for now, and with the success all the pupils have had, I do need to price it a little bit higher, but for this time, for January, it will be priced at £210. So in the webinar, I did ask lots of parent questions, but I forgot to press record. So this is a re-recording of what I talked about last night. What I will do in the email, I'll put lots of the questions that were asked and my answers so that you can learn from that. But if you want to hop on a call with me, if you've got any questions about the 11 plus, the verbal reasoning programme, or any ways in which I can help your child, please get in touch. It's been lovely to talk to you. I hope you found this really useful, and I hope to speak to you soon. Take care. Bye bye.